Lots of us out there, we're bringing on extra staff when we get into the spring and summer months to help take care of parks and recreation centers and a lot of other activities that are going on. Now this year, maybe a little bit different, but one thing that's been in use quite a bit, I've noticed, is the parks. So as we get out there, even in areas where people are under stay-at-home orders, they're getting out and walking and going to the park. And so we're still going to have that need to make sure that we can take care of these facilities this season coming up. And so we want to take a little time today to talk to you about what are our options when we're bringing on seasonal employees. And a lot of those seasonal employees will be youth. And we need to make sure that we're clear on a few of the rules that go along with employing youth, whether that be during the school year or when school's out. And of course, granted, right now, everybody seems to be, not going to school, but they're still in school. And so I would suggest that those rules may still be in effect as far as, how much you can work children of different ages during the school year. So when we look at our seasonals, new hires especially, but our seasonal employees that come on, especially younger employees, we look at an increased safety factor because that experience level. We have these employees that haven't had the same experience working for us. They haven't had the training, and they may have, something that we're not always accustomed to dealing with is that youthful judgment. And so we need to take some precautions in this area when we're bringing on our seasonal crews, especially youth, teenagers, and make sure that we're covering those needs that we have. If we look at the exposure, how it changes depending on how long someone's worked for us. We have situations where you may have, if you have employees working for you for less than a year, we may see injury rates, that are 10 to 50 times greater than those when we have employees that have been, working for us for a while. We got employees that have worked for us for 15 to 24 years. We may see about 4, incidents from those compared to 50, with those that are brand new employees. So anytime we're bringing on new employees, we have a higher risk of injury for those employees. You have different options for your seasonal staff. You could look at using volunteers, adults, youth, or even temp agencies. And so just briefly, we want to go over what these different options look like and what are some things that we need to make sure that we're being aware of and the bases that we're covering when it comes to employing our seasonal employees. Obviously, like I said, our risk exposure is greater. When we have volunteers, they are de facto employees. If they're an official volunteer that's been approved to fill a specific function, they can present, just about any liability for your organization that a regular employee can. And so we want to make sure that we are, taking that into consideration. So there's potential liability from the employee's actions for one thing, but then there's also the workers' compensation liability, which is going to be higher with these new employees. When we have our seasonal staff come on, often they're less experienced. Sometimes they may be people that have worked for us in the past, but frequently they're people that are working for us for the first time. And frequently they're people who are working, period, for the first time. And so we have, less experience. We have that undeveloped frontal lobe, so we get that youthful judgment often with these employees. And then we're increasing the size of our workforce, so, maybe normally have 10 or 15, folks, but then you bring on 5 or 10 seasonal people. So you maybe increased your staff by 20%, 50%, maybe even 100%, depending on, your situation. And so what are your supervisory, requirements going to be there? Are your same supervisors going to now supervise that many more people, so they're spreading their attention that much thinner? Or are we making sure that, we have also seasonal supervisors, employees that are experienced, that we can trust, that we can put in charge of some of these seasonal crews as well, so that we have adequate supervision, because that becomes extremely important in keeping employees safe and making sure that we're not causing undue liabilities. There's also child labor laws, which are something that we need to keep in mind. Another thing that frequently we wind up seeing is when the season ends on these seasonal employees, is that it's not unusual that we'll have a few every now and then that will get injured right at the end of the season. Now, we're not suggesting that they do this on purpose, but it does happen. And so we need to make sure that we have a plan for how would we handle these situations. And if you're not sure, give us a call. We can help walk you through that situation with those employees at the end of the season if there's an open work comp claim. Obviously, we want to be careful not to fire them, because we lose total control over how that work comp claim then is managed, as far as being able to return them to work or them staying on a work comp basis where they're receiving those payments every month. So again, supervision, more workers. We need to get more supervisors as well to make sure our seasonal employees have the supervision that they require. If you think about using a temp agency, there's pluses and minuses to this. We think this is a pretty good option for a lot of your seasonal type work. Number one, convenience. I mean, you don't have to go through the hiring process yourself, all the interviewing that goes along with that. You let the temp agency know what your criteria are, and they fill that. There may be a little bit higher cost to using a temp agency, but at the same time, you're not increasing your payroll. So that helps keep your work comp costs down. So maybe you're paying a little bit more to the temp agency because they're covering work comp and other exposures, while you're going to be keeping your costs down on those. And so when you look at that cost differential, remember there's a cost to bringing in that seasonal payroll into your workers' compensation premium. Volunteers are a great option as well. And often we can get people with phenomenal expertise and experience who are willing to volunteer. And so that's great. It can be a budget saver. But often people who are volunteers are a little more independent. They are giving you their time freely. And so they often maybe aren't as accustomed to being supervised. And so there's often that supervisory challenge with independent volunteers that may not feel the need to be at work or on time or follow all your rules per se. And so it's important that when you bring on a volunteer, that there again is somewhat of a contract or an understanding, so that they know what they have to do in order to maintain that volunteer position. This volunteer represents your entity, like I mentioned before, and they can create potential liability for you. When you're bringing on volunteers, make sure that they are approved, that you have a roster of who your volunteers are, what the specific positions are that they are filling. Those volunteers that are approved and that you have a roster on, are covered for your workers' compensation. So even though we're not paying them, if they get injured, they can get the medical portion of that covered. And so, we're taking care of them that way. And that's preferable to just being open to them suing us on a liability because of their injury. And so when they're an official volunteer, those workers' compensation rules kind of cover that and help protect us on the liability side as well. And again, this would be for like specific positions that we are getting volunteers for. And it's somewhat like a hiring process that you go through when you select your volunteers. Again, keeping in mind that this person is going to be representing you and that they're going to pose a potential exposure, depending on how they fill their position. We need to make sure that we're being careful in those that we select and that we make official volunteers. So we want to look at their experience, their availability, their ability to do the job. We definitely, may need to look at their background or their driving record if they're going to be driving. So when you are bringing in these volunteers, it's important to still have some sort of an information sheet on them. If we were hiring somebody, we would have a job application, but for the volunteers, we need to also be collecting some information about them. There should be, if it's for a specific position, there should be some interview, some criteria that need to be met. Maybe you even check references if they're going to be in a position where there's some responsibility. Background checks can be really important, uh, especially when we have volunteers who may be working with vulnerable populations like minors or seniors. And so we want to make sure we take a look at their criminal background as well as check the sex offender registry, when we're doing those background checks to make sure that these are people that aren't on a list that we don't want to have working with children or people who are vulnerable. When we extend a position, whether it's a new hire or a volunteer, there should be some sort of an offer with a memo of understanding. This could be kind of like your contract for your volunteers that spells out what's expected of them, what shifts do they need to work, what rules do they need to follow, and basically they should be following, the same rules that your employees are following. They need to understand that. They need to have a description of their duties. What is it they're going to be doing? And know what expectations need to be filled. And in addition to this, orientation and training. Even with volunteers, we need to make sure that they have their safety induction, that they know what they need to do to keep safe on the job. We need to identify what the hazards are, the risks are associated with the work that they're going to be doing, and provide them with the appropriate safety training. Make sure they understand it. You probably also want to have give them some harassment discrimination prevention training as well, as making sure that they are familiar with policies and procedures. So safety is, kind of on the top of our list when we're talking about orientation and training, making sure that we're addressing those hazards specific to that position and making sure that we've identified and providing for the appropriate PPE for those positions as well. And again, proper supervision. Just turning, these brand new seasonal hires or these volunteers loose without supervision often can be asking for a little bit of trouble. We need to make sure that we are paying attention to what's going on with them. Let's talk specifically now about minors, hiring minors, period, whether it's for seasonal work or not. There's different categories that we look at when we look at minors. There's rules that are specific to 14 and 15-year-olds. There's rules specific to 16 and 17-year-olds with regards to what kind of hours they can work, what kind of breaks they need to have, the danger level of the work that they're doing, and whether we are going to have them driving vehicles or not. There's very specific rules that we need to be careful with that as well. Basically, if you're looking at hiring someone under the age of 14, we really recommend that you not do that. We frequently will have questions come in about having very young children volunteer in different parts of our organization. And we just need to remember, that it's their safety is very important. And if that young child is volunteering in say, your animal shelter is one that we've had frequent questions about, we want to make sure that they're safe. And if that child gets bit or hurt or something in there, I mean, it's pretty tough to, say that we're being careful as we should be, taking responsibility for those young children. So we recommend that we hire or take those official volunteers at ages younger than 14. So when we look at the child labor laws, we may look at Utah laws and we may look at the federal government laws. Federal laws supersede the state laws if they're more strict. Or actually, we can look at whichever law is more strict, more restrictive, is going to be the law that applies. And there is a couple of examples that I'll share with you, or there's one example in here specifically where federal law is more strict than Utah law that we need to be aware of. So let's talk about this specifically for these different age groups. First of all, minimum wage, there are some provisions for being able to pay some of these minors less than the $7.25 minimum wage during a training period. Before you try doing something like that, you'll want to make sure you're familiar with those rules. There are requirements that they are receiving some specific type of training that they haven't had And probably as a general rule today, and in the employment climate that we're looking at, you're probably going to have a hard time getting too many kids willing to work for 425. But maybe they're out there. But there are limitations to how long you can have that pay. After the 90-day period is up for that training period, then you would have to pay them the regular minimum wage at least. For minors who are 14 and 15 years old, we can't employ them during school hours. During the hours, if it's a day when school's in session, we can't hire them during those hours when school's in session. We also can't hire them, we can't schedule them to work hours before 7 a.m. or after 7 p.m. When we get into the summer months, then that evening hour can be moved up to 9 p.m. So that gives you a few more hours when you can schedule those workers. Now, here's the example I was talking about with 14 and 15-year-olds. If it's a school day, you cannot work them more than 3 hours total in that day. Now, Utah law says 4 hours, but the federal government, Department of Labor laws, say 3 hours. And so that's a case where the more restrictive law is going to apply. So that's our limit on a school day. On non-school days, if school isn't in session, or if it's a Saturday or during the summer, we can work those 14 and 15-year-olds up to 8 hours a day, but that's the maximum. You cannot work those 14 and 15-year-olds beyond 8 hours. They can't get overtime. So you're restricted there. You can work them 8 hours, 18 hours during a school week, and you can work them 40 hours during a non-school week. Again, the hours that they are available to work has to be between that 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. or 9 p.m. during the summer months. We can't work someone under 16 years old, later or earlier than those hours. Are there exceptions to these rules? Yes, there's exceptions to these rules. There's several exceptions. And so if you need, or you've got a situation where you need to have an employee who's 14 or 15 years old, and we have to be outside of those restrictions for hours worked and time and so forth, we can look at, if they already graduated from high school. If we've got a young, kid who's just a genius and he's already finished high school, then these rules wouldn't apply. If they're excused from the compulsory attendance law for whatever reason, maybe they've been emancipated or something like that, that there may be an exception there. If they have a child, if they have a dependent that they have to support, if they've been just kicked out of school permanently, then those rules wouldn't apply either. They may have approved work study that allows them to work more than those minimum hours. But that work study, those programs usually require specific elements and specific requirements to be met to be considered a work experience or a work exploration program. There's also exceptions for youth who are working as attendants in professional sports. Don't have any of that going on right now, so we probably don't have to worry about that too much. But if you had someone who is a ball boy, for a professional sports team, there may be some exceptions there in the law. Now, when we're looking at 16 and 17-year-olds, there's no limitations on the hours that they can work. We have fewer restrictions that we have to worry about with the 16 and 17-year-olds, especially when we're looking at the type of work they can do. But there are still restrictions. We can't be putting minors in inherently dangerous work. And so we need to think about that. We'll talk about those specific types of job functions that they can't do. But when we're looking at minors, we also have mandatory meal breaks and rest breaks. For adults, usually we have those kind of things are worked into our, our employment contracts or our policy and procedures, but they're not required by law. But for minors, it is required by law to give them a 30-minute meal break before they've worked 5 hours, and they need to have a 10-minute break within each 3-hour period. So generally, they're going to have 2 10-minute breaks and a 30-minute break if they're working a full day schedule, for example. And that is required by law for minors. So for 14 and 15-year-olds, what can't they do? And like I said, we can't put minors doing dangerous work. Manufacturing work, mining, processing, hoisting apparatuses like forklifts and things like that. Window washers, if they're working off the ground, is another thing they cannot do. Working around boilers or engine rooms, maintenance and repair machinery equipment. They can't operate a motor vehicle. Well, they're 14, 15. Of course, they can't operate a motor vehicle. You know, we'll touch on that in a little bit. There are sometimes vehicles that, you know, we do think maybe they can operate, like a golf cart. If it's for employment, that 14 and 15-year-olds shouldn't be operating a golf cart. They can't work as a driver's helper on a motor vehicle. They can't ride on the outside of a vehicle as part of their employment. And there's other things that the secretary may have identified. Power-driven machinery. So any of those power tools that Brent was talking about in the safety moment this morning, you cannot have 14 and 15-year-olds operating any power-driven equipment. And that includes lawnmowers, golf carts, and as I mentioned, ATVs, and most of your standard gas-powered yard work type of equipment. Now, when we get into the older kids, the 16 and 17-year-olds, they can operate a lot of that equipment, but your 14 and 15-year-olds can't. Ladder work. So basically, if they're off the ground, if the job gets them up off the ground on a ladder, on a scaffold, on a roof, you know, they can't do that either. Commercial baking and cooking, having them sell door to door, things like that are not allowed. Warehousing, public utilities, construction. Catching and cooping upholstery, because we know chickens have large talons. And so that's, we need to make sure we keep those youth safe there. When we get into the older kids, 16 and 17-year-olds, there's still limitations. We can't have them using explosives or working around explosives, mining, forestry, powered woodworking equipment is off limits for any miner. Operating a forklift, would be off limits. Powered metal forming equipment, powered bakery equipment, any big commercial type powered equipment is probably not something you can have a miner operate, even if they're 16 or 17. If we, other examples here that may be more common to us, wood chippers, cutting discs, doing demolition, roofing, excavation. We don't want to have any miners working in a trench or in any kind of an excavation. Now, the more common questions that come up on this is about having licensed drivers who are miners, operating vehicles as part of their employment. The basic rule is no driving motor vehicles. However, there are exceptions. So when the following applies, you can have a miner operating a vehicle for you. They have to be 17 years old. They can't be 16 years old. They have to have a license for the vehicle that they're operating. They have to have had a state-approved driver education program that they took as part of their driver training. They cannot have any moving violations on their MVR. So, and most of you know that we can help you with get those MVRs. You should be getting a monthly MVR report from us if you're a member of the trust. And so that those 17-year-olds cannot have any tickets on their record. And the vehicle that they're operating can't weigh more than 6,000 pounds. So we're basically looking at passenger vehicles or light duty pickup trucks, or smaller vehicles than that. The vehicle they're operating has to have seat belts for the driver and all passengers, and they have to be using them. They have to be instructed that those seat belts are required to use. And then beyond, just instructions, I'm going to tell you your people who are responsible for these youth that are working for you need to be verifying that they're using those seat belts. The driving also has to be something that's incidental. It's not the primary purpose that they're employed for. If you're hiring a 17-year-old and sticking him behind the wheel all day and they're driving a vehicle around all day, that is going to be something that we can't do. It has to be something that it's just incidental to their regular work operating the vehicle. So this is what that kind of looks like. It can't be, they can't drive for more than a third of their work day or a fifth of their work week. They can't tow anything. They can only, again, operate vehicles under 6,000 pounds. They cannot operate motorcycles or ATVs or golf carts. Now, there may be an exception for this. You know, we've looked up, and there are some letters from the Department of Labor explaining about golf cart operation. And basically what they say is if the golf cart is used off-road, like on a golf course or in a park, just in the grass area of a park, you know, that is okay. But if that golf cart is being operated on, you know, the street on a public right of way, then that is not okay to have them operating a golf cart. They can't do route deliveries. They can't do route sales. They can't do transportation for hire. They can't have any driving that is time sensitive. You can't, like, look at your watch and say, okay, you got to be back here in 15 minutes, you know, and put time requirements for the driving portion of their driving, because we don't want them to be exercising their youthful judgment, feeling in a hurry behind the wheel. No more than 3 passengers in the vehicle, and their driving needs to be within a 30-mile radius of their primary work location. And basically what they do is they look at this as that needs to be limited to like 2 trips per day, you know, if they're delivering equipment or supplies someplace. And so again, remember that with those 17-year-old drivers, we are fairly limited in how much they can be driving and what they can be driving. With your seasonal employees, some other things we want you to remember, I mentioned this at the beginning just a little bit, you know, for workers' compensation, if they've been injured and they're off work, you know, at the time the season ends, we don't want you to terminate them, because again, that loses our control. It's easier for us to get that claim closed if you don't terminate them. So what do? Well, one thing you can do when school starts, you know, assuming they're a college student going back to school, or they're going back to school in the fall, you know, if they've got light duty, if they have, you know, the doctor's given restrictions so that they can do light duty, you give them work to do, and they'll say, yeah, I got to go to school, and then, you know, you get them to resign because it's time to go back to school. That's one way to handle it. But again, if you get to the end of season and you've got people who are off on a work comp or have an open work comp claim, we just want to make sure we're careful on how we handle that transition at the end of the season, so that we do have some control over getting those claims closed. We need to make sure that you know, restrictions are identified. If they have been injured, that we're accommodating those restrictions. We can offer them that light duty, and you know, if they've got other things going on and can't come to work, then they can resign their position. So in summary, when we're talking about new hires, whether it's volunteers, new regular employees, or especially when we're talking about our seasonal employees, we need to recognize that's a higher risk group. We need to make sure that we are taking appropriate precautions to train and supervise these individuals to make sure that they are safe in the work that they're doing. We need to have an adequate hiring process or selection process so that we get the right people in the right positions, and need to make sure that we provide adequate supervision for them, training, and that we're compliant with the applicable child labor laws. You know, and again, if they're not working because of an injury at the end of the season, just don't automatically term them. You know, let us help you, or let someone with our claims adjusters help you through that transition process. Any questions?
All right, folks, I'm just checking here. We got no questions that people have submitted. Please type those into the chat box, the Q&A box. Generally, we get quite a few questions on this, so let's see how Doug did. I think he did a pretty good job of explaining this. It's a challenging subject just because there's so many twists and exceptions and minor details from 16 to 17. It really, you know, there's some significant details, and from 15 to 16, even more than that. So please go ahead and type your questions in there. Not seeing any. Doug, just on that golf cart example that you brought up, when they talk about crossing or about operating on roads, I think in that example it even talked about if you're crossing roads. I know a lot of our golf courses, you'll end up, front nine, back nine, you'll end up crossing a public thoroughfare. Isn't that correct? That even crossing roads falls into that category?
What they said in that letter, I'm not remembering the crossing roads. It would fit with what they said. What they said in that letter, though, was parking lots. If you're driving the golf cart where regular motor vehicles are being operated, then you can't have those, 16, 17-year-olds operating those golf carts in those areas.
Okay. Sounds good. Question came in. What is your recommendation about youth workers under 16 during pandemic when schools are only online? Would you recommend hiring under 16 during this time?
Well, so the question is, are you going to work them more than the 18 hours a week or more than the 3 hours a day? And honestly, I kind of suspected this question would come up. I did some research trying to find an answer, and I couldn't find any answers to that question right off the bat. I suspect we're going to have to probably ask the Department of Labor what their opinion on that is. And that's why I mentioned if they are doing school from home, school's actually in session, they're doing schoolwork, during the day, it is a school day, I would assume and treat it as though they were in school.
Yeah, I would say if it's during the school year, I would treat it just the same. So yeah. And we do have some guidance from OSHA on pandemic conditions, but I don't remember that it had anything in there dealing with young workers. I really don't think it did. Let's see. Question here. So if 17 or under, they can't drive UTVs or side-by-sides.
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
Well, 17, again, with the exceptions that we talked about, they can't be operating them on the road or in a parking lot where regular motor vehicles are also operating.
All right, another question here. You were talking about implementing a memo of understanding with new hires, seasonals, etc. Is that just a job description, safety guidelines, etc., with a line for a signature? I think you were talking about volunteers, weren't you, when you were talking about that?
Yeah, MOUs are basically, kind of your employment contract with a volunteer. It spells out for your volunteer what your expectations are from them. And what they're required to do, what kind of rules they're required to follow. Since they're not actually employees, sometimes they can become a little difficult to deal with, and we want to make sure that they still understand if they're going to fill a specific official capacity, that there are guidelines and rules that need to be followed. So that's what the MOU is for, is with volunteers. Employees are going to be subject to your employee handbook.
Yeah. But if you wanted to go the extra mile and put together something similar to a job description for a volunteer, that probably wouldn't be outside of something we should do.
Well, and especially when it comes to the safety aspect, we need to make sure that we've identified what it is they're going to be doing. What are the physical requirements? What kind of hazards are there, so we know what kind of safety training and PPE to provide. So that's a real important process to go through, volunteers or employees, either way.
Absolutely. And also a legal obligation that we have under OSHA to select PPE and do a documented selection for those types of things. Awesome. This is a very big subject, and one that brings a lot of questions. I know that some of you out there may have some additional questions. Please don't hesitate to call Doug on this. Now, Brett and I would also be happy to answer questions on this subject. But you know, take a minute, look at your policies and procedures, and see how you're doing on that. Brent, you don't have your camera on, so I forget to ask you. Got anything to add?
Nothing else to add. Great job, you guys.
Doug, final word.
You know, the same word as always. Go out there, be safe, but you know, especially right now, take care of yourselves. You know, make sure that you're staying healthy and safe. We'll say. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug. Good job.